It was supposed to be an ordinary morning, quiet, uneventful, and carefully controlled by palace protocol. No royal appearances, no scheduled statements, nothing that hinted at the storm about to break. Yet in a single breathless moment, the nation was plunged into shock. Prince William stepped before the cameras, his face pale, his expression rattled in a way no one had ever seen. His posture was rigid, but his eyes, red, swollen, filled with grief, betrayed a truth he could no longer contain. For several haunting seconds he said nothing, staring into the lens as if searching for the strength to speak. And then, with a voice cracking under emotional weight, he delivered words that instantly shattered the illusion of royal unity. It wasn't just a statement. It was a rupture, an emotional detonation that sent shockwaves from the palace corridors to every television screen across the country. William spoke of loss, of betrayal, of an irreversible fracture inside the monarchy. He didn't name names, but his tone was enough to suggest wounds cut deeper than tradition could conceal. As reporters gasped and social media erupted, the palace itself descended into suffocating chaos. Minutes before William's address, senior aides had begged him to stop, urging him to reconsider the implications. Behind locked doors, top royals gathered in frantic emergency meetings. But William had reached a threshold from which he would not retreat. For him this was no longer about duty or image. It was about truth, his truth, buried for years under royal silence and polished statements. And now he was tearing that silence apart. His speech lasted less than 3 minutes, but in that time he declared a kind of war, not with armies but with memories, secrets, and the emotional corrosion that had been eating at him in private. He referenced, in veiled language, the late Queen Elizabeth's final protocol, a mysterious document rumored to contain her fears, predictions, and instructions regarding the monarchy's future. Many believed it to be locked away forever, yet William's words suggested he not only read it, but was now acting on its warnings. Whatever the late Queen had foreseen, it had been grave enough to haunt her successor. Yet what William didn't say was even more chilling. He made no mention of Catherine. No mention of their children. Insiders whispered that Catherine had begged him the night before, pleaded even, urging him to wait, to think, to breathe. But for William, the line had been crossed long before that night. He had endured years of unraveling behind closed gates, years of watching the institution bend under pressure while he silently carried burdens no one outside the palace walls could imagine. The world saw a prince. But the man standing before them that morning was exhausted, undone, and stripped of the royal armor he had worn since childhood. To understand what pushed him to this breaking point, we must trace the days and secrets leading up to the explosion. For months, murmurs circulated about William's withdrawn demeanor, his sudden absences, the forced smiles that no longer reached his eyes. Rumors hinted at tension with King Charles, but none of them came close to the truth. Hidden deep in the royal archive, behind reinforced doors and decades of sealed correspondence, William uncovered something that shattered his belief in the monarchy he was destined to lead. It began with a key. A master key once held by Queen Elizabeth herself, then passed quietly to Charles. In a moment of desperation and rising suspicion, while Charles was abroad, William used that key to access his father's private archive. There, inside a locked drawer, he found confidential letters exchanged between Charles and a foreign head of state, correspondence that should never have existed, let alone been hidden. The content exposed secret negotiations involving land, titles, and assets tied not to the government, but to personal royal interests. They undermined Elizabeth's vision and hinted at alliances capable of destabilizing the monarchy's integrity. Horrified, William confronted palace legal advisors, only to be stonewalled with rehearsed answers and careful warnings. A cover-up had already begun, orchestrated by senior courtiers whose loyalty was not to transparency, but to protecting the institution at any cost. William had pierced a veil he was never meant to touch, and now every door was slamming shut around him. His relationship with Charles deteriorated rapidly. Conversations turned cold, then confrontational. According to one insider, the shouting between father and son reached a level that forced staff to clear an entire wing of the residence. Catherine, ever the calm in William's storms, tried desperately to anchor him. She urged him to consider the cost, to think of their children, to resist the urge to burn the system down. But William felt he had been silent too long. Silence had made him complicit. And on that morning when he stood before the cameras, he chose truth over tradition, no matter the consequences. Now the only question left hanging in the stunned silence of the nation was this. What comes next now that the future king has declared emotional war on his own crown? If you do this, she warned him, you will break everything, the family, the fragile public trust, the illusion of unity keeping the monarchy afloat. But Catherine's plea came too late. The truth had already ignited inside William like a wildfire, consuming hesitation and fueling a moral resolve stronger than any protocol. He wasn't acting as a prince bound by duty, he was acting as a father desperate to shape a monarchy his children could believe in. And while the world remained unaware of the turmoil consuming the palace corridors, another storm was quietly gathering momentum, one involving a name the royal family had spent years trying to erase from the narrative. As William's voice echoed across global broadcasts, raw and irreversible, another event unfolded behind the scenes, one that threatened to reignite a fire the institution had spent decades smothering. Just as the world reeled from the future king's emotional detonation, a royal aircraft sliced through the morning fog and descended onto Heathrow under total secrecy. Escorted by elite security officers and omitted from public flight logs, it carried a passenger who had been absent far too long, Prince Harry. He disembarked silently, avoiding cameras, his expression grave, his eyes hollow from sleeplessness. Clutched in his hand was a sealed, aged envelope bearing the royal crest, unmistakably personal, unmistakably historic. It wasn't a briefing. It wasn't protocol. It was a letter from his mother, Princess Diana, retrieved from a vault so hidden that even palace veterans had forgotten it existed. But Harry hadn't flown home by choice. He had been summoned under a rarely invoked emergency succession clause triggered the moment William's announcement went live. Every bloodline royal was required to return to the UK, even those who no longer served. Meghan refused. According to insiders, she feared the optics, the manipulation, the emotional cost of walking back into an institution that had consumed so much of her spirit. Harry boarded alone, pressured from all sides, carrying far more than the envelope the world would later obsess over. When he reached the palace, the situation only deteriorated. Princess Anne and Prince Edward confronted him directly, blocking access to the private residential wing. Witnesses described a charged standoff in the West Corridor, raised voices, accusations hurled across centuries-old tapestries, and security stepping between them. Anne's words were sharp, unwavering. "This isn't about your feelings. It's about the survival of the crown." Harry's response was just as fierce. He held up Diana's letter, demanding to see his brother, insisting the contents couldn't wait. But William was gone. Immediately after the broadcast, he had retreated to Sandringham and had cut all direct lines of communication. What should have been a quiet family reckoning was now a public implosion unfolding in hallways filled with staff who pretended not to hear the echoes of royal collapse. Then came the most painful revelation of all. William had intended for Harry to receive a private version of his speech, one delivered by hand before it aired publicly. But somewhere between palace messengers and protocol officers, something went wrong. Whether through interference or bureaucratic sabotage, Harry never received it. Instead, like millions around the world, he learned of William's emotional rebellion through news alerts and social media. The betrayal hit him like a blow. Intentions no longer mattered. The damage was irreversible. And in a corridor lined with portraits of monarchs who once shaped the world, the brothers stood face to face again. Two men connected by blood, severed by wounds deeper than duty. One insider claimed Harry asked only one question, his voice steady but wounded: "Was I meant to be blindsided? Again?" William didn't answer. Because even he no longer knew where the line between intention and consequence had blurred. Their fractured bond shattered further, leaving behind only echoes of their mother's legacy, her hopes, her fears, and now her hidden letter. Yet Harry's arrival wasn't the most shocking part of the day. What came next shook the palace to its core. As the world replayed William's trembling voice and analysts debated the consequences, few noticed the faint silhouette behind the palace window. A woman standing still, shoulders trembling, hands pressed against the glass. Catherine. The silent pillar of the monarchy. The steady presence behind every crisis. The woman who had endured reputation battles, institutional betrayals, weaponized rumors, and a shadow of illness that had begun to seep into her daily life. But this time, something within her had finally cracked. Her health, whispered about in guarded conversations and carefully worded palace memos, had been deteriorating for weeks. Staff spoke of sudden collapses, dizziness, days when she barely left her bed. But the physical decline was only one part of a far deeper unraveling. Emotional exhaustion had seeped into every corner of her existence. The burden of secrets, the suffocating silence, the endless nights spent trying to pull William back from the emotional cliff he kept edging toward. She bore it all with grace, but even the strongest hearts fracture under relentless pressure, and Catherine had reached her breaking point. Her collapse wasn't broadcast, but it wasn't hidden either. Hours before William's address, a leak emerged from within the palace. A private journal belonging to Catherine, containing confessions, fears, and truths she had never intended to share. And once those pages slipped into the wrong hands, the final piece of the royal facade shattered. How the journal had been obtained remained a mystery, but what it contained was devastating. Inside were pages of quiet agony, disappointment, and unfiltered dread. One line, buried among the entries, hit with the force of a scream muffled in ink. "I wish I had left before this broke us all." That sentence, raw, haunting, and undeniably human, spread through the world within hours, defining Catherine's unraveling more powerfully than any official statement ever could. She had never spoken to the press, never once broken royal protocol, but now her pain had a voice louder than anything Buckingham Palace could control. Insiders revealed that Queen Elizabeth had once implemented strict protection protocols around Catherine, sensing early on how vulnerable she would become as the crown shifted into a more tumultuous era. But after the Queen's death, Charles quietly dismantled those protections, insisting on a leaner, more centralized monarchy. Without the late Queen's safeguards, Catherine became exposed, emotionally, politically, and personally. She begged William not to go public, not because she doubted his intentions, but because she feared the cost. She had already watched him crumble under the weight of the secrets he had uncovered, truths no heir should have ever carried alone. She warned him that once he spoke, the monarchy would never recover. Yet William, driven by truth and scorched by duty, had crossed a point of no return. And so Catherine stood alone, not in front of cameras, but in dim palace hallways where grief clung to the walls and silence hurt more than any headline. But while she withdrew, another voice rose, one that had remained quiet too long. Princess Anne was ready to unleash everything. No one speaks like Anne, not in riddles, not in hesitation, and never in fear. When she entered the private royal chamber moments after William's seismic announcement, the temperature in the room seemed to drop. Advisors froze mid-sentence. Camilla stiffened. And for the first time in years, Charles looked unsure. And didn't shout. She didn't need to. Her words struck harder than any raised voice. This is not what she wanted. 6 simple words that hit like a gavel crashing onto a fragile throne. Denial evaporated instantly. The room knew exactly who she was. Anne's fury was not vague or symbolic, it was precise, aimed squarely at Camilla and the senior aides who had insulated Charles from dissent. She accused them of something far more dangerous than a simple cover-up, the deliberate distortion of the monarchy's bloodline integrity, and claimed that Elizabeth had left behind private final instructions, sealed personal directives never revealed to the public, concealed even from the Privy Council. They were not ceremonial notes but protective measures crafted in her final year, as her health declined and her trust in the new regime faltered. According to Anne, those instructions had been buried because they threatened the power structures now benefiting from their erasure. When Anne cited those secret documents, Camilla erupted. What followed wasn't an argument, it was an explosion. Anne questioned the legitimacy of Camilla's expanded ceremonial role and even asked whether the late Queen had ever fully approved the title she now wielded. Camilla, trembling with anger, stormed out, but not before spitting out a bitter claim that she was the only one holding this family together. Anne's response was a razor-sharp whisper, "Then no wonder we've come apart." After the confrontation, Anne asked for a private meeting with William. In a secluded royal study, she produced an envelope that had been hidden for over a year. Its edges were worn, the seal carefully preserved. It bore Queen Elizabeth's private crest and had been kept under Anne's personal protection since the Queen's passing. She handed it to William silently. In that moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. Inside were handwritten pages, part reflection, part warning, and one chilling line that changed everything. If the weight becomes unbearable, trust only the blood. Anne's act wasn't rebellion. It was reckoning. She had drawn a line between duty and denial, between tradition and the modern distortion that had overtaken it. Her intervention wasn't about power, it was about restoring what she believed had been stolen through quiet ambition and hidden manipulation. For William it brought clarity. But clarity carried a price. Because within the Queen's reflections lay a truth even he hadn't been prepared to confront. One involving someone too young, too innocent, to ever be entangled in a war for the crown. Anne's next revelation stunned him. It centered on a child. A boy barely tall enough to reach the podium his father had just stood behind. Yet behind the sealed doors of Buckingham Palace, Prince George had unknowingly become the epicenter of a crisis threatening to split the monarchy in two. The public had sensed something was wrong. his sudden disappearance from outings, his cancelled appearances, his forced, fleeting smiles. Now the truth surfaced in the most shocking way imaginable. A clause buried deep within Queen Elizabeth's private will had finally surfaced, and its impact tore through the palace like a silent explosion. This was no gentle suggestion or ceremonial flourish. It named young Prince George as the vessel for a different monarchy, one untouched by the compromises, political games, and quiet corruption that had slowly hollowed the crown from within. The clause outlined a secret inheritance and mentorship program the Queen established in her final year, designed to bypass traditional handlers and place George directly under the guidance of three people: William, Anne, and a mysterious unnamed figure outside the royal apparatus. But the most jarring part wasn't what the Queen included, it was what she deliberately left out. In 14 handwritten pages, there was not a single mention of Camilla in any matter concerning the next generation. The omission was intentional, unmistakable, and devastating. The moment this revelation leaked, the palace erupted into silent war. Camilla, already enraged by Princess Anne's increasing influence, now found herself cut out of yet another royal future. Catherine, who had spent years shielding her children from internal politics, refused to release George for any engagement outside her own supervision. The passive tension between the two royal women finally combusted. Witnesses described a fierce confrontation in which Camilla accused Catherine of orchestrating a succession trap, using the Queen's final wishes to erase her influence permanently. Catherine's reply was icy: "You were never part of her plan." Suddenly George's months-long disappearance from public life made sense. He wasn't sick. He hadn't been sent abroad. He was being protected. Princess Anne had taken it upon herself to fulfill the Queen's private directive. In a hidden ceremony inside one of Elizabeth's personal chapels, and presented George with a symbolic relic passed down through generations, an artifact given only when the future must be safeguarded at all costs. Its identity remains one of the palace's most tightly guarded secrets, but its meaning was unmistakable. George was no longer simply a boy. He had become the embodiment of what remained worth protecting. Yet this revelation ignited a brutal counterattack. Loyalists within Camilla's circle began circulating claims questioning the authenticity of Elizabeth's writings, whispering about manipulation or forgery. What followed was not merely a dispute, it was a legal and emotional war, with a child trapped at its center, burdened with a legacy he was too young to comprehend. And while the world focused on George, William prepared a response that would redefine the monarchy. Camilla believed she had secured her place, after years of maneuvering, surviving scandal, and standing beside Charles as queen consort. But she never imagined how quickly the ground beneath her feet could collapse. As dusk settled over the palace and tension thickened the air, William stepped into the royal gallery, not to honor tradition but to rewrite it entirely. The speech he delivered was not ceremonial. It was a declaration of open war against everything Camilla had built in the shadows. With one chilling phrase, he announced the Royal Reset Order, a sweeping directive signed and sealed that restructured ceremonial hierarchy and removed Camilla from any influence over the next generation. Her name wasn't lowered. It was erased. Overnight she vanished from rosters, planning documents, and future succession frameworks, wiped clean from the legacy she had fought to claim. Gasps echoed through the marble halls as the decree was read aloud. Camilla's expression turned to stone, but behind her eyes raged a storm she could no longer disguise. The palace reacted instantly. Several staff members loyal to her resigned in protest, slamming doors and making their fury known. But many others stayed, and some quietly applauded. For years they had operated under a tense, suffocating power structure. Now the hierarchy had shifted, and for the first time Edward and Catherine stood united, their once subtle coordination revealed as a carefully planned alliance. The final blow came in silence. Charles watched from a private balcony, expression unreadable, offering no defense. Whether his inaction came from shock, guilt, or agreement, no one could say. But his refusal to intervene left Camilla exposed, a queen consort in title only, stripped of support and legacy. Then came the image that would etch itself into royal history: Camilla being escorted out of the East Wing by royal guards, her footsteps echoing sharply against the stone, tears streaking down her face. It wasn't exile, not officially, but it was the closest the monarchy had ever come to publicly rebuking its own queen. And yet, even after all the fallout, one final twist waited in the shadows, hidden not in legal documents or royal decrees, but in the last voicemail Princess Diana ever left her sons. Buried beneath decades of silence, sealed by grief and guarded by protocol, one voice refused to vanish. Princess Diana's final recorded words, long believed lost, resurfaced on the very night the monarchy threatened to collapse. A dust-covered tape pulled from a locked royal storage unit unexpectedly crackled to life, freezing the room as Diana's soft, haunting voice cut through time. Never trust a crown that forgets its roots. In that moment, every illusion William had clung to shattered. The brief recording carried devastating clarity. Diana spoke of betrayal, manipulation, and forces within the palace that had twisted her truth. One line struck William like a blade: "If they ever rewrite your place, know it started with her." He knew exactly who she met. Overwhelmed, William locked himself away, realizing every painful decision he'd made aligned with the warning his mother never had the chance to deliver. He gave the tape to Princess Anne, trusting her as Diana's fiercest defender. That night at Windsor, the recording played again, this time before George and Charlotte. As Diana's voice filled the quiet room, it felt as if history folded inward, allowing a mother long denied power to reclaim her place. Word of the voicemail leaked and ignited the public. Vigils appeared, candles burned, and a wave of grief swept across generations. But the next shock came from the last person anyone expected. After days of silence, King Charles stepped forward, not with authority but with regret. In an unscheduled address, his voice trembled as he confessed he had failed to protect his family and allowed the crown to fracture what mattered most. Then he stunned the nation by announcing he would step back indefinitely from royal duties and restore Queen Elizabeth's unpublished final wishes as official protocol. Her hidden letters and directives would now guide the monarchy's future. His final words struck the nation with rare humility: "Let the future be theirs, not mine." And with that, the old era ended, leaving a monarchy forever changed.